Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've seen a couple other videos, today we are going to talk about the public sphere. We're going to get a little bit into Jürgen Habermas. Not a lot, it's more of a grad school topic, but it's just a name you should know with regard to how the public sphere has developed, changed, morphed, sort of how it is the way that we know it today. So, first thing, as far as any good academic, we are going to start with South Park. Now, I used to be able to find somewhere in the deep weirdness of the internet sort of bootleg copies of this episode of South Park, the Safe Spaces episode, probably 5 years old now. Season 19, episode 5. If you have any access to the South Park library, I don't know, I think it might be on Hulu or ComedyCentral.com. I would recommend that you watch the entire episode. It's like 20 minutes. But it's a safe space episode. It introduces this guy, PC Principal. But if you can't do that, there is this 1.5 minute music video that is from the episode itself with regard to this idea of safe spaces. So if you don't know the premise of the episode, what happens is Cartman is getting a lot of negative feedback on his online social media accounts. And so PC Principal comes in and makes Butters his moderator. He makes Butters go through and take out all the negative comments of Cartman's social media accounts, and it turns into this interesting back and forth with regard to how do we sort of censor the internet, right? So it's not just about it's not just about sort of like censoring polite face-to-face conversation in a classroom, but it's, we have lots and lots of people who are just piling on the internet saying awful, disgusting, vile things as you would, as people do on the internet, but then as you would expect to be highlighted in a South Park episode. But the reason I show this to my students in the beginning of class is because I think it sets up an interesting conversation with regard to what are the pros and cons of sort of public sphere speech, right? So if we think about the internet, if we think about it as like a wild west of communication, it allows everything to be posted, right? The most vile trolls can say the most horrible things to each other, and we say, well, we don't want, nastiness and impoliteness, unkindness being perpetuated online. But my question always becomes, what's the alternative? All right, and what history shows us is there is an alternative historically, and what the alternative historically is this, right? It's that traditionally only elites had access to public spaces, right? Only the elites had access to, before internet, newspapers, television stations, congressional speeches, right? These large microphones, these large platforms, only the elites had access to them. So obviously a pro of opening up the public sphere is that everybody can now contribute to the conversation, right? The obvious con is that everyone can contribute to the conversation, and there are some people who I would prefer not to, be voicing their vileness online, right? But there's this sort of like give and take, all right, with the pros and cons of sort of full access. Everyone's allowed to engage in the conversation in what we are going to refer to as the public sphere, all right? All right, here's this guy right here, Jürgen Habermas, all right? So he wrote his dissertation, and it became this book. He's German, so it's written in German. Became this book known as the structural transformation of the public sphere. And some of the things he talked about is sort of as society became more, and it traces how society became more open with regarding to more people sort of coming out into these public areas to discuss politics, culture, social events, what have you. All right, that's what it traces. You can take an entire grad school class just on this topic, so I'm not going to go too much into it right now. But what we need to know is that the public sphere sort of opens up debate for what we call common concerns. So if, topics of discussion are placed into the public sphere, it probably means that people want to talk about it. All right. So over here we have a picture of a bunch of individuals sort of like sitting at a mat, passing around a pipe and probably some food, and discussing the politics of the day, right? What's going on in their community, what's going on in their town, what's going on the national level. More and more average ordinary citizens over time have been included in these larger public discussions. If you think way back when, you have like a king and his council discuss how are we going to move forward politically with our country, and it's a handful of people making decisions for everyone. The conversation starts to open more and more and more, and they go out and people start to organize in streets, people start to hang out in these saloons. So if you think about like your local watering hole, your local bar, right? You go there and sort of talk about the events of like what's going on in your community with all the other guys there, you know, during happy hour after work, right? This is what the public sphere is, right? It's expanded into places like online forums, right? So you have these community Facebook pages, right? You have people organizing on Facebook and Twitter to go out and protest, right? To petition the government for grievances, right? This is what we're talking about with the public sphere, right? And again, the pro is that more and more people are involved. It's not just a handful of people at the top. The con is that more people are involved, and there's some people who I would prefer not be involved in these conversations because of the unkindness, etc. All right. Now, the public sphere is more inclusive, right? And there is this pushback with regard to more inclusive. And what I say to that is like, you know, more inclusive relative to what? So is the public sphere today more inclusive than it was 500 years ago, right? With regard to various markers like, you know, women are allowed into the conversation, right? So it's like, that's a good thing, right? Are they completely included the way that some people think they should? Maybe, maybe not, right? But it's like the public sphere has been on this trajectory of more and more and more inclusion with regard to opening access to more voices to be involved. What I let people know is like, yes, the public sphere conversations when sort of average ordinary citizens were getting involved were exclusionary, and they did marginalize people for certain reasons, right? But it also created a foundation for expansion, okay? So things like women's suffrage were, that comes out of a tradition of when the country was first founded, America was first founded, it's like you are allowed to petition the government for redress of grievances, and you can say, well, you know what, that was only for like, you know, white property owning men. It's like, yeah, but the fact that it was put there for the first time ever, it's like that was better than the system we had before. And since then, it's become more and more open and inclusive, where all of a sudden now in the early 1900s, women's suffrage is getting rolling, and finally by 1920, women are allowed the right to vote. Same thing is true with the civil rights marches of the 50s and 60s. When the founders put the Constitution together, were they thinking, you know, black individuals should be allowed all these same, you know, rights under the Bill of Rights in the Constitution? Some of them, yes. Some of them, no, right? But the foundation for the Constitution was more expansive and inclusive than the rules under Great Britain. And then we got in the Constitution, and this sort of opened up a door for more and more and more inclusion. So the public sphere, as we think of it, like originally sort of conceived, was exclusionary. It was mostly like a bunch of men going to a bar who probably had some connections with political leaders in their community, right? But that's better than just the politicians talking in a back room. So now we have the politicians talking in a back room. We expand it to, okay, more people are talking. They have connections to politicians. It's probably mostly property-owning men, right? But that's better than the system we had before. And then the public sphere opens up a little bit more, right? Now we're including women. We're including racial minorities, right? We're including people of different sexual orientations, right? It's like it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it is on this trajectory of expansion, which is a good thing, all right? Without the public sphere, without sort of open and free debates, we wouldn't have had things like women's suffrage, the civil rights, etc. All right, so Jürgen Habermas traces how the public sphere becomes more inclusive of more voices. More people are getting out and being engaged in their political discussions of their community. The other thing that the public sphere tracks is this relationship between capitalism and democracy. And this is how it works. So there was this rise of what we call the mercantile class, so individuals who have their own shops, you know, think of farmers markets today. As people generate more money, they want more say in their politics. So as the mercantile class was expanding, 500 years ago, as it started expanding, people wanted the ability to control the fruits of their labor more often. They didn't want all of their money just to go back into the state, right? They didn't want to be tied to the land with regard to serfdom, right? These lords overseeing, them and their land, right? In the United States, you can see similar things. So what do I mean by this? When we look at demographics, all right, when it comes to voting, the people who are less likely to vote are the people who don't feel like they have as much to gain in the economics or in the political system with regard to where they're at in life or their economics. So younger people, people who have less income, right, people who are poor, these individuals are less likely to vote than people who are older and who are more wealthy, right? And the reason is because people who are older and are more wealthy, they feel like they have more to gain or lose based on who's elected to the presidency, for instance, right? Young people kind of feel like, well, I'm just in school. I don't really have like a full-time job right now. It's just like I kind of work a minimum wage job either. Whoever the president is, it's probably not going to affect my life that much because I don't have a lot of sort of personal or economic capital. All right. Now, are younger people in college affected by the presidency? Yes, they are, right? But they don't feel it in their day-to-day life and their day-to-day paycheck like somebody who's older, maybe making $100,000 a year, right? All of a sudden they get their paycheck and it might be the difference between $2,000 of taxes being taken out and $3,000 worth of taxes being out. And you're like, $1,000, that's a lot more than, a dollar here, a dollar there if you're only working a minimum wage job, all right? So as capitalism starts to rise, as people have more say over their own income, they want more say in the politics. They want more say in like who is sort of controlling their taxes, how their money's being spent. The government only works via taxes, so anytime people say things like the government should get bigger and smaller, the specifics of that is, the government should get more money or the government should get less money, which comes through taxes. All right, that's the only way the government works. The government can say we want to do a million things, but if they don't have the money to do it, it's like they can't do those things anyways. All right, so the government only works based on taxes. Sometimes we call them revenues or fees. It's all going to the same place. So, if I have money, right, if I have more money as I accumulate money, right, the rise of the mercantile class, I want more say in how that money is spent, how my elected leaders spend that money, all right, because all of a sudden I'm giving some taxes over to people and you should be a good steward with my tax dollars, right? So there are people who are out there talk about like, earmarks and pork barrel spending where they sort of highlight what they feel are egregious use of taxpayer money. They're like, why did the government spend $1 million on this ridiculous program or this type of research? And then they argue that it, wasn't good stewardship of money. Then you have people who voted for that program and say, no, like that was a good use of taxpayer money because it's going to help out in, this sort of research endeavor. All right, that's the only way the government works. And if I am contributing more money to the government because I'm making more money and the government taxes me at a certain rate, I want to be more involved in the politics. So again, we go from a king and his advisors making all the decisions for everyone. Then all of a sudden the public sphere starts to open up, right? And it becomes, citizens talking in streets, talking in bars, talking in saloons, talking, whatever, right? Because they want more say in how their life is being ran. And if they have to contribute to how the government works, right? Back in the day, if it's just a king, it's like the next king is going to be the king's son, right? It's hereditary. There's no use in revolting because the next king is just going to be the prince, right? Now it's like, ooh, the next president could be this guy or this other guy. I have a say in that every 4 years. Yeah, I'm going to get more involved. So again, like I have more control of the government. Oh, the government's going to tax me 30% or 25%. This is very interesting to me because now I'm more contributing to the government. So I want more say in how the government's being ran and operated. So capitalism, having more control over my choices, having more control over my money, that means I want to be more engaged in the democratic process with regard to electing leaders who are going to create policy and who are going to tax me. All right. If you go back to, again, tyrannical times, if a government system's in place where they just end up taking most or all of my money anyway, then it doesn't really matter who's in charge, so what's the point of saying anything? All right. But as governments start to become more liberal democracies over the last, few hundred years, more and more people say, okay, I get to elect my leaders. I want more say in how my taxes are spent. If it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, the government's going to take all my money in some sort of, again, like serfdom, type of idea, then it doesn't really matter who's in charge. All right. But as capitalism rises, as I have more control over my life, I want more say in who my leaders are. Here's a little chart that just sort of tracks democracies and sort of like how, so here we have like the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? So Soviet Union collapses, and we see this big upshoot of sort of people have more access to their own capital, how they're going to spend their own money, and we see this sort of takeoff in the democratically elected leaders, all right? Finally, with democracy, okay? I'm going to put all these links in the YouTube comments below. You can check them out if you want. But it just talks about how, a staple of democracy is being able to speak one's beliefs even if they're unpopular. So again, part of the biggest downside of sort of everybody gets a say on online forums is that some people are going to say awful things. But you have to always look at their alternative. And the alternative is, back in the day, there was a handful of people, right? Kings, monarchs, tyrants, who told you what you could and could not say. You can go back to that, right? But the role of the public sphere has constantly been expanding to include more and more and more voices. Now we're to sort of like peak free speech moment, and people are like, ooh, maybe we went a little too far. Maybe we want to start contracting that again, right? And maybe we want to tell, the CEO of Twitter, right? Hey, will you take down some hateful things? We want to tell our administrators on college campuses, hey, will you not allow certain speakers on campus, or will you remove this group from campus? That was sort of how this speech thing worked in the beginning, right? It was one person or like one sort of leader, right? One administrator at the top, we called it a king, right? Now you call it like, the university president. You had one person making rules and policies for all the speech, sort of for all the people that person was in charge of, right? But we expanded that and said, no, like I don't want a handful of people making the rules for free speech. I'd rather have everybody just speak freely, and I understand that that's going to come with a cost. And part of that cost is some people are going to say awful things to each other. But you always have to think, like, what's the alternative? And the alternative is giving a handful of people control over the issue of speech. If you do that, then all of a sudden, today they might censor things that I dislike, but tomorrow that same group of people might start coming after things that I do like. All right? So you have to be careful with how much power you want to give back to this small group of people at the top in order to make rules about what you can and can't say online, in the classroom, what have you. All right? So here's a couple articles. This is a YouTube clip from the organization FIRE, which is Freedom of Individual Rights in Education. That talks about how free speech works on public university campuses. This is an article where Bill Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, different articles, talk about supporting this issue of free speech, condemning violence, but supporting people to say things even if you disagree with them. And then a couple other examples of where free speech has been called into question, where both Brandeis and Knox have censored or curbed certain speakers or artistic displays. At Knox College, it was a play that they canceled because they deemed that some of the elements of it were racially insensitive. The person who was putting on the play said the point of the play was to show how racially insensitive history was, like they were showing the racial insensitivity. That was the whole purpose of the play. And so here's a few examples of where sort of free speech has been squashed. But again, you go back to this model of you either have a handful of people at the top, college administrators in this regard, squashing it, right? Which is what used to happen, right, with kings, right? They used to squash speech they didn't like. Or you say, look, we're going to allow everything, but if we allow everything, that means sometimes things are going to get through that are, objectionable, right? That we don't like or we don't want to see. But you have to sort of weigh the pros and the cons, right? It's not like we can't create a perfect world where everything, we're going to open up free speech, but we're going to create these rules that are always going to be followed. It's like speech constantly evolves, it constantly changes. The people in charge of censoring speech right now aren't going to be the same people in 10 years. So if you give those individuals power to control speech, when the next administration comes in, are you going to be okay with giving those new people who you might disagree with, are you okay giving them the power because they might start coming after your free speech? So small little rant on this. Reminds me of a conversation I had with my friend the other day with regard to some of the election stuff. One thing that I think we missed the point on presidential elections is people continually argue for the person who should be president as opposed to the policy and the procedure of what the president should or shouldn't do. What I mean by this is that if you were a person who voted for Obama and you were like, let's give the executive branch all this power, right? You had to, like, then you're only committed to the person. What happens when you give, because you're not giving President Obama power, what you're doing is say expand the executive branch and give the executive branch power, right? The president just sort of holds that place for 4 to 8 years. What people weren't thinking long term is they're like, let's give Obama all this power, right? And the next guy who comes in is Donald Trump, which a lot of people obviously find objectionable, right? However, you just gave this system all this power, and so the person who came in after now has all this power that you just granted to the process and the procedures of the executive branch. The same thing is true when it comes to censoring free speech. If you don't like certain speech on your campus, you can go to your administrators and say, I want you all to be in charge of censoring certain speech on campus, but you have to recognize that that board of 10 people who are in charge of this, it's going to rotate every few years. It's going to be a different committee next year. You might like your university president now. The next person who comes in, you might not like them at all. Do you want to give them the power to have that sort of control over your speech that you're going to hand off to them if the person that you absolutely dislike gets into a position of power? So you always want to be careful about, you're not just giving a person power to curb speech, you're giving the system power to curb speech. So when it comes to curbing speech, or when it comes to free speech in general, do you want a system where a handful of CEOs and administrators at tech companies and universities have the power to curb speech? Or do you want to say, want to have free and open speech, because that way we can all be involved in the conversation of the public sphere. We can tell other people not to use certain words, right? But we understand that there's a risk that every once in a while someone's going to jump into the conversation that's going to say something awful, all right? Quick last example of this. This is a book called Notre Dame versus the Klan. And it's an anti-Klan book. It's, Notre Dame sort of fought the Klan. The Klan went to their campus, and here we go, how the Fighting Irish defeated the Ku Klux Klan, right? Same with the book. A couple years ago, there was this woman, and I'll call her out because her name is all over the documents, and she was an administrator, and she made horrible decisions, so she should be called out. Maybe she's changed her ways. But her name's Lillian Charleston, and she was in charge of, there was a student who was on campus. He was an older gentleman. I believe he was a custodian, and in his free time, he was taking classes to get his college degree, right? So everything that you want, like a hardworking guy going back to school later in life to get a college degree. During one of his breaks, he was out on the campus quad. He checked this book out from the library and was reading it on the quad. Somebody saw that he had a book, and on the title of the book said the Klan, and you're like, okay, the Klan's objectionable, but they saw the title on the book, and he was actually sanctioned. Somebody reported him to Lillian Charleston, right, who did a little investigation, and at first you might say, hey, there's a guy on campus who has a book about the Klan, and you're like, ooh, is there a KKK guy on campus? We need to go check this out. But it turns out he was only reading a book, even though, Lillian Charleston knew that he was only reading a book after the investigation. She still sanctioned him and said, look, mister, you used extremely poor judgment by insisting on openly reading the book related to historical and racial abhorrent subject in the presence of your black coworkers, right? So again, he was a custodian on campus, right? And I don't know if I want Lillian Charleston to have the sanctioning power to tell people what they can and cannot read when it comes to library materials in the open on a university campus. That seems horrifying, right? Now, you might agree and say this was a terrible decision by Lillian Charleston, but what I'm telling you is if you give a person like this power to curb speech in general, again, like eventually these types of individuals are going to come after speech, are going to make decisions that you disagree with. So the question becomes, do we allow everyone to speak openly? And sometimes bad things are going to get said that we don't like. Or do you want to give the power just to a handful of people and then run the risk of, for the United States, 330 million Americans being at the mercy of 535 people in Congress making the rules on speech for all of us, right? And I would rather side on the idea of everybody going out there, saying openly what you want to say, and then we all get to debate it out as to what sort of is polite and impolite with regard to public speech, as opposed to having a handful of administrators curb speech and regulate speech for all of us. I want a more and more open and inclusive public sphere. I don't want to start contracting it and say there are some people who shouldn't be allowed, and therefore we want to give people like Lillian Charleston the ability to tell a student that they can't read a book in public, openly reading a book. That sounds very 1984 and Fahrenheit 451. You openly read an objectionable book. It sounds awful, right? So I would rather have all of us debate these issues in an open and inclusive of all voices in the public sphere, as opposed to regressing historically and contracting the public sphere and say, okay, we opened it all up, and now we're going to start contracting it and kicking people back out. It's been opening. I would like the public sphere to stay open for all debates and conversations to be on the table, all right? Okay. So that's the little introduction to the public sphere. For this class, we're going to go over some stuff on the Constitution and free speech specifically tomorrow. But just, Jürgen Habermas, the public sphere, think about how it's going to be either open or closed, how it can be inclusive and not inclusive, and whether or not you want all of us at the table debating these topics, or if you want to give a handful of, politicians or bureaucrats the ability to curb speech for all of us, right? That's, at the end of the day, I mean, that's the decision, okay? That's all I got for now. I will see you all next time.